This is a podcast about our lived experience, which unfortunately includes infant death and subsequent mental health struggles. Please take good care of yourself and only listen if this content feels safe for you right now. We'll still be here when you're ready.
Hi, I'm Judith.
And I'm Alina. We both lost babies to SIDS in winter 2021.
In the throes of grief, I reached out to a stranger on the internet and our friendship was born.
In the years since, we've been working hard to survive, rebuild, and navigate the continual challenges that have come our way, including divorce,
Job loss,
dating while bereaved,
moving multiple times,
health scares,
pregnancy and parenting a living child,
starting new jobs, and so much more.
We are tired.
Happily ever after is out of the question for us, but this podcast documents our journeys to happier ever after because we believe life after loss is worth living.
So join us as we laugh, cry until we laugh.
Welcome to As Long as I'm Living podcast.
We're so glad you're here.
Oh, hi, everybody. Welcome to As Long as I'm Living podcast. This is Alina Quinn's mom.
And this is Judith Eden's mom.
And we are joined today in a continuation of our series that we've started. We started this back in November of 2023 with Rabbi Nissan Antin talking about Jewish support for grievers, which was an excellent episode. I will link that in the description if you haven't gotten a chance to listen to that yet. But today we are joined by Presbyterian chaplain Reverend Marcie. Marcie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. I will say, so I'm Reverend Marcie Brozyna, and I'm the mother of Rumi. So he died at 26 weeks, so I had a 26-week stillbirth. But in my work as a chaplain, I have been providing support to parents, pregnant women, other people who could be pregnant, partners, families, in regards to loss for 15 years. So
Wow.
I went into ministry because I wanted to be a chaplain. I'm an ordained Presbyterian minister because I wanted to be a chaplain. And so I was not expecting necessarily loss work, so much of my most meaningful loss work to center around children dying. But that is what has emerged. And then, of course, I have experienced it myself.
And did your work in that space predate your own loss?
Yes.
Wow.
By years. I think, let's see. So I've been a chaplain about 14, 15 years, and my son was stillborn 6 years ago. So if we do the math, 8 years of chaplaincy prior to losing my own son. And I think part of my sadness about it is when I became pregnant, I said to myself, okay, this won't happen to me. All of the things that I have seen will not happen to me. And I think that's part of the deep sadness for me, because I think when you work in healthcare and you are exposed to children dying, you really do need to tell yourself that it won't happen to you. Healthcare workers are carrying a lot of vicarious trauma from what they see and experience. And in order to cope, we do have to separate ourselves. And so much of my coping was kind of a mantra of, won't happen to me. And then it did.
Yeah.
So, I feel like I'm very well versed in my little niche of faith, but I'm very not well versed in every other one. It's embarrassing. But I actually think that, if I'm not wrong, being a chaplain is non-denominational. All denominations, all religions, I guess, have chaplains. So if you could just kind of give us a 2 or 3 sentence overview about what a chaplain is and how being a Presbyterian minister is related to chaplaincy. What exactly do you do, and is it faith-based? If so, could you explain?
Yes. Excellent question. So a chaplain is a spiritual care provider in a non-solely religious setting. So chaplains do not work in a synagogue, in a church. They work in a third space. So hospitals usually have a chaplain. Sometimes fire departments have a chaplain. The police may have a chaplain. Of course, the armed services has chaplains. Some businesses have chaplains. And the purpose is to provide emotional and spiritual support in whatever way the person receiving it needs. So I would not call myself an expert in all religions by any means, but I am trained to be able to support people of any religion, any sense of faith or spirituality, or someone who does not have any connection to any particular faith and maybe has not given it any thought. It may not be important in their life, or they may be atheist and that's their point of view. So I'm trained to be able to provide emotional support to anyone and everyone. And then a lot of that training for me centers on my definition of spirituality. So for me, spirituality is relational. So it's my relationship to myself. It's my relationship to those around me, my community. It's my relationship, from my point of view, to God or higher power, meaning, purpose. And I think everyone has a sense of spirituality, or I should say everyone is spiritual, because we're all relational. And so whether we would consider ourselves spiritual or not, we're relational. And the support I do is relational, relationship to self, to those around us, and to the world.
So you'll come into a situation, say a traumatic situation, a difficult situation, and your role is to support that person in that moment. Did I get that right?
Yes. So in my context, I have always done hospital chaplaincy.
Okay.
So we are brought into situations in a couple of ways. One is that the patient themselves may know that a chaplaincy exists. Some people know about it, some people don't. And they may say, do you have a chaplain? I need to talk to a chaplain. When intake is done in the hospital, they're supposed to be asked, and would you like to see a chaplain?
Okay.
Which prompts people oftentimes, those encounters are interesting when people say yes, because it may be based on how they're doing with their health, but it might be a completely separate topic. And they take that opportunity of being in the hospital to discuss that different topic.
That's interesting.
Yeah, marital troubles, other areas of loss. And actually, a lot of people want to talk to us. They're in the hospital for a medical crisis. Frequently, people come to the hospital after the loss of a loved one. So you may have a patient who had taken care of her husband who was unwell. He dies. 2 weeks later, she has a health crisis, comes to the hospital. And it's a great opportunity for that patient to get support. When we're grieving, our bodies are more likely to fall prone to illness. Our bodies suffer when we grieve. So it's a common phenomenon that people will come in shortly after a loved one's death. And then also the interdisciplinary team in a hospital setting. So doctors, nurses, unit secretaries, social worker may say, you know what, this person has a lot of existential wrestling that they're doing. They may be faced with whatever loss or changing situation they have. They may be wondering, why is this happening to me? Experiencing deep grief and pain. And those are situations that we encourage the interdisciplinary team to reach out to us, because there are a lot of people in the hospital who can provide emotional support. A good nurse can do that. A good doctor can do that. A psychiatrist, a therapist, social worker, someone from environmental services. Everyone can be kind and supportive emotionally. But I think when it comes to the existential wrestling, that's really when the chaplain is the most benefit.
Would you say you typically come in when there's like a life or death situation, whether that is that person's life or death or a loved one of theirs' life or death situation?
Yeah, I would say at least a third of the patients I see or situations I'm involved in, the person is either actively dying or death
has been given a diagnosis.
Yeah.
And
interesting.
So, I have so many questions. I don't even know which way to go, because I feel like we could go in so many different ways. But I would love to hear from you from the times when you've been involved with a child loss.
Mm-hmm.
Do those conversations look different? And how do you provide support for those families? And
Yes. So, and that's also interesting in the context of my own son dying, because it has definitely changed since my son died. So I will go into, 14 years ago, my first chaplaincy experience, the first death of a baby that I was a part of was a full-term stillbirth. I was a very new chaplain. I was in my early 20s, and I felt so much just the depth of pain and grief and horror of this baby's parents. And I felt like, and honestly, I wasn't really well prepared to provide support to them. This is changing, but with chaplaincy, a lot of training is, we're going to throw you in there. You know, you have received an education from whatever your faith group may be. So maybe you went to rabbinical school. Maybe you went to seminary. Maybe you have a degree in an somewhat aligned field. And chaplain training goes, okay, so you have that training, and then we'll teach you how to funnel it into providing support to all sorts of people in these settings. But I didn't have any education on how to provide support to someone whose baby has just died, or who has just given birth to a dead baby, or whose child has died suddenly, tragically. So I think my first encounter, the words that I used were probably not particularly helpful. They were not hurtful. You know, we always do no harm. And I did what they asked. And the reason that they had brought in a chaplain is they specifically wanted a baptism for their baby who had died. So I did the baptism, and that's very meaningful. It's really important to acknowledge the personhood of
person who's died.
Yeah. And especially, you know, I think the younger a person is, whether they be a small child, an infant, whether they were a developing baby in utero, there's such a need for the parents to feel the acknowledgement of personhood. And the community that knows that baby, that child is smaller, the younger the baby, the younger the child. And so I think it makes that acknowledgement of their individuality and their worth even more important. Mm-hmm. So in doing the baptism, I definitely provided a sense for the family that, all right, our baby matters. Our baby is a person. They are getting the same rite ritual that any living baby would have received within their faith community, and they were Catholic.
How does Christianity, I know there are many different, you know, sects of Christianity, faith traditions. How do they approach baby loss specifically? Because I think it's different in every faith how that's approached, especially as you're talking about baptism, which I think is an interesting point.
So a lot of my early work was really centered on doing the ritual that this family needs. And I used to, people in the midst of their grief and either preparing to lose their child, let's say their baby was in the NICU, or let's say their child is chronically, incredibly ill, and they know that the future is not good, and they are doing this processing. In my early days, a lot of my work was centered on, but God's with you and God will help you through this. And I think that is a common response of people from any faith, to have a faith leader remind them that God is present with them. But since having my own loss, and we'll look to Presbyterian Christianity and the background of that and how it intersects with losing children. But after I had my own loss, I realized there is little to no use in telling a person that God will get them through and that God's presence is with them. The real value is letting people struggle and letting them know that they're not alone and that their feelings are normal. So having had my own stillbirth, I will say to families, if people express some sort of faith tradition, if they express a belief in God, I will say, some people find their faith very comforting when they lose a child, and other people do not. Other people will find their faith a source of pain, and that's normal. And that's a huge part of what I just do as a chaplain anyway. Because I would say, regardless of faith tradition, the more religious people are, monotheistic faith, right, encourages people to have faith and to trust in God. And if they are feeling despair in a difficult situation, the feeling that comes with that is guilt. Like, I'm not trusting enough. I'm not relying enough on my faith. And so now you've added a layer of guilt onto all this grief. So I will say, you know, wherever you are spiritually from this is healthy, is normal. And that I think is very freeing for people. And I think it's really important to be said. And I would say as a Presbyterian, and then the Presbyterian denomination is one of many Protestant denominations, and then one of many Christian faith expressions throughout the world. In the modern Western world, we don't have a lot of child death. In the United States, you know, SIDS, infant mortality, stillbirth, and miscarriage are the worst of any thriving nation. You know, it happens far too often. But if we look at rates in other parts of the world where there isn't the resources, and if we look at historic rates, you know, we have low levels of children dying. So I really think that in Christianity in general, it's just not addressed. It's ignored.
Let me ask this because I don't know. When a baby is born in the Christian faith, what would it, and it's a healthy, alive baby, what is the normal, I don't know,
set of rights,
welcoming process? What does the normal process look like, and how would it be different if the baby was died or something like that? What does that normal procedure look like in terms of religion?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most but not all Christian traditions will baptize babies. So I would say most parents who are of the Christian faith would seek out baptism for their baby, probably sometime within the first year of life.
And baptism, I don't mean to ask like a dumb question, but baptism is.
Yeah. So different Christian sects understand baptism differently. So it can range from, this is a ritual that was given to people who follow Jesus as a way of remembering and honoring Jesus and his work, to a view of God's spirit is very present in this ritual in a special way. And when we do this, we are uniting God's spirit and this child. And I don't know that most people have really given it a whole lot of thought. I don't think your average person who is of the Christian faith is really worried about, you know, whether it's a sacrament or whether it's a rite, a ritual, a remembrance. It's really a rite of passage and a welcoming into the community and acknowledging like that this baby is part of this spiritual community.
Okay.
Which is why it's so important for families and parents when they lose a baby to have the ability to have them be baptized or blessed.
Yeah. Of that, if a baby, let's say they haven't baptized the baby yet, let's say because like our sons died when they were like 3 months old. Let's say like we were planning on doing it later. They haven't been done yet. Like, does that mean anything for their personhood? Does that mean anything of like in terms of like, do they not have a place in the church? Like, does it matter?
You know? Yeah, that's a great question. So if you ask someone of the Catholic, like if you were to ask an older Catholic, they might tell you unbaptized dead babies go to purgatory. So that was a popular Catholic belief. But the Catholic Church has since said, no, you know, purgatory doesn't exist. So there was a lot of
purgatory being not heaven, not hell.
Yes, an
like
in-between
limbo
space.
Yeah. Parents of children who's died and they didn't have a chance to baptize them because that's so unsettling. Like I bring so much comfort from the fact that I know my son is at peace, but if my son was in purgatory, I would feel like they were wrestling of some sort.
Yeah. And I don't think so. And a lot of patients, though, you know, though I'm not Catholic, a lot of people in the US are Catholic. So a lot of people that I have worked with are Catholic. And decades ago, that would have been the worry. Like parents would have been fearful that, you know, my child is alone in some weird third space. But the Catholic Church said in Vatican II said, no, there's no purgatory. So I don't think people tend to carry that worry anymore, but I have had grandparents be present when a baby has died and been like, I really need you to baptize this baby. Because again,
from parents as like their spiritual concerns.
Yeah. So I think really the biggest spiritual concern is how could God have let this happen?
Yeah.
It's not concern for what, like, where's my child's spirit? And I have reflected on that in my own life too, because the spiritual distress and pain of believing in a higher power that has allowed your child to die really overshadowed any concern I had for my child's spirit. At some point I was like, oh, I am relieved that I just kind of assume that my son's spirit is with God. And I'm just kind of assuming he's okay. Because yeah, in a different context, my biggest worry could be, does he even exist anymore? Where is he? Is he feeling pain? Is he safe? Is he being loved?
Yeah.
So I think,
I mean, this is interesting to hear you share that from the Christian background, because that is exactly what Rabbi Antine was saying as well, right? Like that is, and Judith, you from your faith, like that is something that people struggle with, is if I believe that, you know, if I believe in this God that is all powerful and good, how could this happen? And I can, as someone who is not religious, I can see how that would be something that would be really a challenge to wrestle with and hard to reconcile. And that's something Rabbi Antine talked about in Judaism, and I'm hearing you talk about it with a Christian faith as well.
Well, I'm curious how you answer that, because I could tell you what my spiritual guide said to me, but I'd be curious to hear you say, like, yeah, what do you say when people express that concern? Like, how did this happen to me? How did God let this happen?
Yeah, I say I wrestle with that and I don't have an answer. And this is, you know, it's emotional. And
yeah,
I say, like, I will never not be angry about God letting my son die, but it's something I've learned to live with my relationship with God. So it's uncomfortable.
Honest answer.
Yeah. It's uncomfortable and it's painful. And I don't think I will ever have an answer. So I have to live with a faith that's in tension, believing that God has the ability to intervene and didn't. And some people in the Christian faith, and this is actually a big part of Presbyterianism, though it's not a part that is particularly appealing to me, is this idea that God is in control of everything. So a big part of Calvinism, and denominations that are rooted in the theology of John Calvin, is God is the sovereign ruler of all, and God is organizing and ordering the world. And if something happens, like someone dying, it was meant to happen.
And when you said that, you mean like the idea is that he's explicitly, you know, moving the pieces around and setting things in motion and not just letting it happen, but actually like moving the pieces around and doing it, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah. The concept of God's plan. Right. Like God has a plan for this. And so you will find a number of Christians who will use that as part of their coping. And I think the idea of, okay, this isn't random, God had a plan for this, can be very comforting for some people, because it takes away the pain of why. It's kind of like, well, I don't know why, but I know God meant good by it.
It takes the randomness out of it, and randomness can be terrifying. Yeah, it is. I'll say that as an atheist, it's terrifying that this just randomly happened to me, right?
That is not the direction you and I lead.
No.
Even though I grew up very religious, and I have like a very spiritual background
with a sovereign involved God
God. Yeah, but I know that for a lot of people, that is how they lean, and that brings them comfort.
Yes. And in the loss community, like let's say as a broad community, in my experience, that's often placed upon the griever, especially in religious communities. It's, you know, God has a purpose. God meant their life, their death for XYZ. And to me, it's a real minority of people, of parents who've lost a child, that find comfort in that. I feel like they should find comfort in it, because again, that's what's expected by the majority religious community. But yeah, it doesn't appeal to me. It doesn't ring true to me. I once looked up the stillbirth rate for great apes. And I was heartbroken. It's like 10 to 13%. Of chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, you know, and they are emotional, intelligent creatures, and I'm sure that they grieve. You know, unfortunately, death is part of the world, right? And human beings are part of nature. And I don't think God has a purpose for that baby orangutan dying. Like, I don't think that mom gorilla is heartbroken and will always remember that loss because God had some deep purpose there.
Yeah.
I think the world is incredibly hard, and I don't understand, as a Presbyterian minister, I don't understand the relationship to God's power and the suffering in the world and a loving God. And so I really try to lift up for grieving parents and family members that it's okay to not know, and to also not believe that there was any sort of purpose in their child dying.
I can imagine that giving them that space in that moment is almost probably a way that's going to allow them to maintain their faith in it easier than if they were trying to be forced into a feeling a certain way. As you were saying, like, if you add guilt into the mix, like, that's you're already in so much pain.
On that guilt question, because I know I don't know about cultural nuances of Presbyterian, but I know that Jews and Catholics have one thing in common, and that's guilt. And I feel like, I wonder if you hear, what did I do wrong? How, is that something you hear? And how do you respond to people who say, like, did I do something to cause this? And I don't mean like in a physical sense, because I think all of my children like wonder physically, but I mean, like, did I do something to spiritually deserve this punishment in that way?
Yeah, I think it comes out perhaps in the opposite wording of I tried so hard. Like I've really tried to be faithful, or I've tried to be, I tried to have the perfect pregnancy, or I've worked to keep my child safe their whole life. And in that context,
did I not pray hard enough? Was I not clear about,
Exactly what, those are the types of things that I had asked myself. Did I not dress modestly enough? Did I not pray enough? Did I mistreat someone? What did I do? And I also did say the things that you said, by the way. The minute he died, I said, I did everything right. I tried so hard. I was such a good mom. But I'm curious, like, how do you respond to that? And it may be a cultural thing, meaning like it might be that some of the people, I know Alina probably didn't have that. She certainly was not wondering if her skirts were too short than what I was.
So, yeah, we're talking now about the ways that religion, having a spiritual background, maybe potentially adds more pain, but I can also imagine there are so many ways in which it provides a significant amount of comfort that was not an option to me. So when you were speaking before about knowing your son is with God, I can imagine that is really comforting. You know where he is, right?
Well, I would say I know with a good dose of humility. So I, to my knowledge, have never been dead. I, to my knowledge, have never been in the afterlife unless souls are recycled and I just don't remember. So everything that I believe, I try to have humility about. So yes, I do. And actually, I had a really great dream that made me feel better, because I was like, oh, I really do believe his spirit lives. He's never, his little body, his little being has never been in my dreams in his human form. But sometimes he'll appear as a different symbol. But I had a dream I was in the kitchen, and my two subsequent living children ran into the kitchen. And I kept feeling kind of this little wind and sense of movement that I couldn't see what was going on. So I grabbed some like sprinkles, like baking sprinkles, and I threw it. And then I saw the outline of Dobby. It was Dobby from Harry Potter. But Dobby to me so much represents my son, because part of my husband and I, as part of our resting and trying to distract ourselves but immerse ourselves in grief, watched all of the Harry Potter movies after our son died. And the scene where they're burying the dead Dobby and they have him wrapped in a cloth, we just broke down, because it was so much a visualization of what we had just been through. Yeah. So to see a little sprinkled covered outline of Dobby running around the kitchen, I woke up feeling so much joy. I was like, oh, I guess I really do believe that his spirit's alive and with us. Because again, what do any of us know about the afterlife? So that I was so glad that I really do believe in an afterlife.
That's so special. That's so nice. You mentioned like the Dobby's burial, but I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about burial rituals, mourning and grieving rituals in Christianity, and obviously specifically in Presbyterianism, unless if it differs. And if there are any nuances when the deceased is a baby, of course you can include that as well. But I'd be interested to hear.
Sure. Yeah, I think it holds true that the older a child is, the more the community rallies around the parent. Again, because more an older child has had connection and contact with more people. So I had a funeral for my son, and I would say funerals are increasingly prevalent for stillborn babies, certainly for infants. But I know that even a couple decades ago, that was not the norm. And I think that's pretty common throughout Christianity. Again, the root of it, I don't know the root of it's probably partly sexism, because it's a woman, this has happened to especially for stillbirth miscarriage. This has happened to a woman, and it makes people uncomfortable. And as a community, we just don't want to deal with it. Or minimizing the loss and not recognizing
just upper lip, this, feelings, just stop feeling your feelings and they'll go away. Type mindset.
Yeah. And especially too for babies, like, well, you'll have another baby. And this is a lot of, kind of this sense of like, well, they're replaceable and interchangeable. And but it was very important to me to have a funeral. And most of the people that I have worked with have some sort of, if not a full funeral in a church, some sort of ceremony of remembrance. And again, whether they're Christian or of a different faith background or nothing in particular, most people incorporate some sort of ritual, but that's definitely a newer practice. And just talking to a lot of older people who've had miscarriages, stillbirths, baby die of SIDS, our good family friend, his baby died of SIDS at 3 months old. I don't think they had a funeral. One of my aunts had multiple stillbirths, no funeral. There just wasn't that permission, or I think even the idea to have the freedom even to have one. And that's really too where faith leaders are very important, because it may take a faith leader saying, would you like a funeral? Like, that is something that we would be honored to do for you, or honored to do for your baby. And I think there definitely needs to be more awareness just in community of faith about how meaningful losing a young child or losing a baby in pregnancy loss is.
So something I see a lot in the loss social media world is people talking about Jesus. And people who reach out to us, a lot of them talk about like what I don't like, my baby is with Jesus. Like there's a lot of this like kind of like visual art with Jesus. And
Jesus holding the baby while they hold Jesus' hand.
Jesus, the baby's return to Jesus. And I guess because I'm not as familiar with Jesus that I find it like I'm a little confused. And I just want like further clarification about like, do all dead people go to Jesus? What does that mean? Is it like, what does it mean that they're returning to Jesus? What part of that brings comfort? Because I see that it brings so many people comfort. And
to the point that when people share their baby has died, they don't say my baby died. They said my baby went to be with Jesus, right? That's the language that is very, very, very frequently used.
And it almost feels like they use it interchangeably with God. And I guess like I'm confused about that. And I don't know if that's like a dumb question because I don't know about Jesus, or if that's like
No, it's funny because, I am a Presbyterian minister and I went to seminary and I had to write papers and do an ordination exam. And my daughter was asking about Jesus. And I was like, oh, I don't know. I don't know how to explain what Jesus is in Christianity. So it's weird. It's kind of, there's different ways of looking at it. So in Christianity, the belief is there's one God. Right. But like a clover, like it's just one 3-leaf clover, but that there's different persons of God Like each little piece of the clover, a 3-leaf clover, would be one of the persons of God.
Okay.
And it's traditionally Father, Son would be Jesus, and then Holy Ghost. People now say, like people who are less patriarchal would say parent, child, Holy Spirit.
Okay.
God the parent, Jesus, and then the Holy Spirit. So yes, Jesus is interchangeable with God, and you could say that Jesus is a person of God, but then it also gets confusing because we think of Jesus as the Son of God, but Jesus is also the Son of Mary. So it's just confusing, is what it boils down to.
Saying that this, whoever it is, Annabelle has returned to be with Jesus. What they're saying is Annabelle is with God.
Yes. Yeah. And I think too, for Christians, the thing about Jesus is God doesn't have a face, right? Like even sometimes we think of God as like an old man in the sky, but Christians have, whether it's an accurate depiction of a Middle Eastern man, I don't think so, but they have a sense of like, okay, I can envision a person like what Jesus would look like again in their mind, not probably, I'm sure not in an accurate sense. And so it's giving this idea of like my baby is being taken care of by a person that I can visualize. And that is more comforting than like some amorphous spirit.
Yeah. And to be clear, when someone says they're with Jesus, it also means they're in heaven. And so if right, because Jesus, well, I mean, I'm assuming, I'm actually asking the question, is that right? They're saying, oh, my baby's in heaven. So they feel like they're in a wonderful spiritual place for eternity. And that also brings a measure.
Yes. I will tell my kids that their brother is with God because I don't know what I feel strongly that they're with God, but I don't feel like I can say with my theology that they're necessarily in heaven. But yes, you're okay. Or if what heaven looks like or what heaven is. Right, but yes, your average Christian who is saying that their loved one, especially child, went to be with Jesus is thinking heaven and, a life of perfect love and no pain. And I think especially too, if your child's been sick, that's the idea of your child no longer being in pain is huge.
Okay, I have 2 follow-up questions. The next one is, we get a lot of people telling us that they found Jesus and they found Christianity in their loss. Right, Alina? We get that.
Yeah.
We want to share that story. I am not as familiar with that. I think in my community, I just don't see that happening. People after a loss coming towards the faith. So for adopted
brand new. They might become more religious if they were already religious, but it's unlikely that someone would be like, let me convert and become Jewish because my baby died.
No, never. But I see people who like explicitly say that their baby died and then they became Christian and they found meaning and purpose and they found peace. Okay. So can you talk me a little bit through, like, I mean, if we see it, I assume you see it. What is the thought process there? What is it that experience like lends itself to? I'm going to convert. I'm going to dedicate myself to Christ. Like what? Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, my first instinct is to just say that a suffering, grieving parent is looking to maintain a connection to their child, and that religion in general can offer a connection. And then, I can't speak to any individual person, but I'm assuming either something about Christianity, and maybe it was the personhood, the idea of being able to have a sense of the person that is taking care of your child. So I can't speak to any individual person, but it is also prompting in me an interesting question of people who ascribe to a certain faith and then experience this loss and what that does to their spirituality. And then someone who wasn't of any particular faith gaining in their mind a relationship with God. So I mean, that would be that's interesting to just explore more.
I'm definitely interested. I think
I wonder if there's something to, like, I don't think Orthodox Judaism is particularly accessible, but I do think
not even, but you know what's interesting? Okay, first of all, I 100% agree. We tend to be the opposite. Inaccessible.
Of accessible. Yeah. It's a big deal to convert. But if you're someone who, like, if you can pick up the Bible and read a comforting story about Jesus and that brings you comfort, that is a lot more accessible to the average person. Yeah. I also want to just add here that as someone who grew up atheist, always atheist, never had any religion in her life growing up, my parents were spiritual, but we did not go to church, nothing, right? my son died, if you had asked me the day before, I would have said, you're worm food, you're gone. There's nothing, there's no soul, it's whatever. The day after, if you'd asked me the day after he died, and now I'm like, yeah, he's still around, he's still kicking. So like, I have not developed a relationship with a being that is a higher power that I would refer to as God, but I have gotten significantly more spiritual and more comfortable with things that I can't see in front of me.
Well, I'll say, and I can only speak to my community, like I said, but I wonder if there's also a piece of like, there's structure, there's answers, there's guidelines. Like if you all of a sudden, if you come to a conclusion that like things just happen and you just feel like this utter chaos and nothing is in your control. And here is a community, here's a faith that says, no, something is in control. Let me tell you exactly what is in control and how it manages the world. Maybe that just finding kind of system and order feels comforting. Or maybe I could also say, like, I think there's something we said about community. Like Alina and I talk about this all the time. What my community, how my community supported me versus how her community supported her, it looks different because mine is so interconnected and it's just so intensely focused. And hers is like an amalgamation of like her friends and family and people she knows. It's not like there's a prescribed community. Maybe people feel like there's just a community, people, someone to show up at. So, okay, that was my next question. But then this is my really last question, and it's a hot topic, so I should have saved it for earlier. But I want to talk about termination, like termination for medical reasons, and the Christian faith, which I know is different, Catholic, Christian, like I get it. And I'll say that's probably...
And we're not going to ask you to speak for everybody.
I will not ask you to speak for anyone, but I'll ask you, like, from your religious perspective, like, how do you speak and offer support to people who had to terminate for medical reasons, knowing, or not had to, chose to, knowing that that is a controversial... Well, some sectors of the faith might feel it's controversial.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think too, with the stories coming out from women in red states where abortion has been outlawed, and women / people who can be pregnant sharing the way that their grief has been made worse and their journeys have been made worse by not having the ability to end a pregnancy, of babies who would suffer horribly upon birth or are non-viable, hopefully is really helping people who have a rigid sense of when life begins or the rights that a fetus / baby should have. Hopefully that's broadening their understanding.
Black and white.
Yeah. I would say have, from my own experience too, I mean, I was of the sense that, developing fetus as a baby, at the same time, a woman needs to be able to make decisions about her body. And so that's where I lived. And then with my own son he had chromosomal differences, and I was hopeful that he was going to survive and be fine. He had Down syndrome, and we were putting things in place to support him. Most babies with Down syndrome will not make it to 20 weeks. And then after 20 weeks, there's a 33% chance of stillbirth. And that's what happened to me. And in that, I was like, oh my God, it just really solidified that I would never, ever, 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 ever judge someone for wanting to choose the way that they return their baby to God, because it was such a horrific experience. And so I would come from that angle of, you, the parent, have made a decision that was kindest to you and to your baby. And that's what we are called to do as parents. And I'm so horribly and deeply sorry that you were in that position and ever had to make that choice.
Judith puts it like some of these restrictions and laws are just creating more lost parents that are experiencing loss at a gestation or an age of the child that makes it significantly more horrific. Not that it's not that it's not always horrific, but it's forcing circumstances that are not what someone would have chosen, which adds a whole other layer of grief.
I really appreciate your perspective, and I've learned a lot. Reverend Marcie, whatever you want me to call you,
Marcie.
I just want to thank you, because I feel like this was a really thought-provoking conversation, and I appreciate just the nuance.
The vulnerability, the openness. I feel like I learned a lot, and
it would have been such a source of comfort to have someone like you by my side in the case of my son's death.
Thank you.
And you're lucky. The families that get to work with you are so lucky to have someone who is as nuanced and as sensitive, and I can tell just as experienced as someone like you, and most people don't.
Thank you. Oh, I know. Oh, I know, right?
Yeah.
And that's like the biggest, though I don't believe my son died for any purpose, right? I do strongly believe that in his death, I am invited to do good. And it really, my ability to provide support for lost parents now is I provide much better support than I did originally. And so like, it's so meaningful for me to be able to give back in that way. And
it's a way you're able to continue to parent him. That's how we feel.
Yeah.
And it feels special.
Yeah. To all of our wonderful new friends, we want to hear from you. Email us at aslongasimlivingpodcast@gmail.com and follow us on Instagram at aslongasimlivingpodcast. We'll get back to you as soon as our grieving brains allow.
Yay!